This is the fourth session of the series Critical Race Today, A Global Look, the fourth session and the third lecture. We'll get to the lecture in a minute, but as always, there are some essential announcements. First of all, the talk will last about 40 minutes, and then we will have ample time for discussion. And as is true every time, we can go over by as much as 15 minutes if people want to. And then it can continue on some other sort of platform after that if people want to continue talking. John has asked me to continue to encourage you to keep your cameras on so that the speaker is talking to live faces rather than to assorted pictures or names. That's always reassuring. We have some updates for the 30 students who have signed up for the certificate program for this series of lectures. And that is, we are opening up a folder, and we want everybody to submit the comment, the posting, whatever it is they're going to do, to that folder. That doesn't prevent them from posting to the NYI social, but whatever you do in that regard, please send it to this folder. And Vinny is going to set up this folder. Vinny, let me just ask you to walk through the nuts and bolts real quickly so that I don't mess them up.
Yeah, sure. So I'll be making a shared folder, a shared Google Drive folder that anyone who's enrolled in the certificate, I'll just, shoot you an email saying that I shared it with you. And then at any point, feel free to just drop your post there. And then the NYI social, that's more of like an optional, like if you use that, you can drop it there. But for the certificate, you have to drop something in the folder.
So we formalized it just a little bit. For the certificate, you have to put it in the folder, but otherwise just continue doing what you were doing, and that's just fine. John has, is this a suggestion or a prikaz, John, that we must rename ourselves?
We work only with suggestions.
Okay, good.
We do not employ other methods.
Well, that's a tremendous relief. Okay. Okay. I also want to continue to encourage you that while the lecture is going on, as you have some observations, some comments, some suggestions pertinent to what the speaker is talking about, feel free to post them on the chat. And feel free to respond to other people's comments and suggestions and questions on the chat. And then when we get to the question and answer period, we do what we've done the previous few sessions, and that is raise your hand or put something on the chat. I'll monitor the chat. And so far, that process has worked pretty well. But we want you to, as something occurs to you, we want to encourage you to post that on the chat, because that encourages other people to respond to your post on the chat. And that has proven to be very productive, at least in my opinion. Okay, now on to today's business. Today's speaker is Manuela Boatca. I won't explain to the multitudes who are here how much effort went into learning how to pronounce her last name correctly, but we did this scientifically. Okay, let me read the little biographical blurb that she sent me. Manuela Boatca is a professor of sociology and head of school of the Global Studies program at the University of Freiburg in Germany. She's published widely on world systems analysis, decolonial perspectives on global inequalities, gender and citizenship in modernity, coloniality, and the geopolitics of knowledge in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. This is a global forum indeed. She's the author of Global Inequalities Beyond Occidentalism, which was published by Routledge in 2016. and co-editor with a bunch of other people of Theorizing Society Across Borders, Globality, Transnationality, Post-Coloniality. That is in Current Sociology, Special Issue 2021. Finally, her co-authored book, Creolizing the Modern, which interests me a lot, Transylvania Across Empires, is coming out in 2022. So the title of her talk today fits into that broad parameter really, really well. It's entitled Disparaged Europes Between Catching Up and Falling Off the Map. So Manuela, please.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you all for having me here. Thank you to Giovanni, who introduced me to this forum. I'm really looking forward to engaging in a conversation, and please let this be a conversation, especially if I'm not making any sense or I'm talking too quickly, which I tend to do. Please feel free to let me know, and also to ask questions as to something that might be central to what I'm saying, but I haven't defined it, then please raise your hand or make yourself heard and tell me, okay, I don't know what this is, let's talk about it, okay? We will have ample time for discussion at the end, but it doesn't hurt to have something in between. As well, as dynamic as this is, the better for me. So I'm gonna share the screen here and hope it works. Should be this. Okay. You should be seeing it now, right? Okay. So the title, Disparaged Europes Between Catching Up and Falling Off the Map, is really a summary of my experience of trying to get a grip on the notion of Europe after having migrated to Germany from Romania some 25 years ago, and realizing that after I had been raised to consider myself European, migrating to Germany in the years before the so-called Eastern enlargement, it wasn't so clear in the West that I was really a European citizen, because Europeanness was being gradually narrowed down to European Union membership. And at the same time, I had grown up in downtown Bucharest with the privilege of not having to think about whether or not I was white. But migrating to Germany in the mid-90s, it was a question of the gradations of whiteness that the European Union expansion and the discourse of how white, Christian, and modern Europe is, was being applied to the notion of who belongs to this community and who is a white Christian European, but the white and the Christian were not always explicit. So out of my own conundrum and out of not really having a toolbox within German and Western sociology to deal with this conundrum, I started thinking about how many Europes there actually are and how unequal they are among themselves, although my discipline, sociology, tends to think about and speak from one coherent Europe, apparently. So the subject formation within sociology starts from a notion of Europe as modern society and expands from that as if that were true. So what is Europe in theory? Not only, well, it is actually a whole theoretical framework, but it is also the title of a great book by Roberto Dainotto, Europe in Theory in Parentheses, that is actually exemplifying well the way Christianity and whiteness are central to the self-definition of Europe. You have this white Christ on a cross being watched by a bunch of people from what we then learn in the book are Italian balconies. So the understanding of Europe from a particular part of Europe becomes, in Roberto Dainotto's account, a problematic one. What he does I'll explain a little bit later how that hangs together, how that comes into play in the notion of Europe that sociology exposes. But this notion of Europe in theory for social thought or for sociological theory is really a legacy, a longstanding legacy of social theory that I think is one that operates with a sanitized version of European history. And I mean, when I say sanitized, I mean it is a version of European history that disregards and for a long time has gone without considering the east of Europe, and for a long time has not considered the south of Europe. This is actually the problem that Dainotto has. He starts his book by saying, I want to speak about Europe from the perspective of the so-called pigs countries, the ones that were disparaged in the context of the financial crisis of 2008 as the ones not being able to meet their debt and to meet their financial requirements. So for those of you who are not familiar with that very disparaging abbreviation, the PIGS countries were supposed to be the ones opposed to the BRICS countries, BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, as the ones that were developing, and the PIGS countries were Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Sometimes the pigs had two I's, and it was a P, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. And obviously, the connotation of the abbreviation was one in which the BRICS were considered something solid and something to rely on, whereas the pigs, well, you don't want to go there. You don't want to be the filthy one that does not meet their requirements. So this version of European history that disconsiders or doesn't even mention the East as part of Europe and kind of includes and excludes the south of Europe as it sees fit or as it is convenient is also one that has operated with a version of history that does not take into account European colonial rule and European colonial past, and does not consider its imperial role and its imperiality. So the European empires often considered pre-modern, so we don't need to talk about them because they are not part of modernity. Why is this important in the context of discussing disparaged Europes? For the east of Europe, there have been enough or at least rich theorizations, starting with, or maybe one of the more prominent examples, Maria Todorova's understanding of spacing Europe, the notion that she proposes of Europe as an unmarked category, seeing that the minute we say Europe, we very probably mean France and Germany. It is not clear whether we mean Romania and Bulgaria, and we sometimes and sometimes do not include Norway or Spain or Italy. So the unmarked Europe is the one that we don't need to qualify. The one that we need to qualify is one that is not part of the paradigm and is not part of the prototype of what Europe is supposed to be. It's not the cradle of Europeanness. Others, of course, have discussed this from a more historical perspective, such as Dipesh Chakrabarty's plea to provincialize Europe in order to lead away from what he calls the hyper-real notion of Europe that has taken over the understandings of what modernity is, what the proper nation state is, what proper functioning of government is, and so on and so forth, and reduce that to the provincial, actually localized history that Western and actually more concretely Northwestern Europe has told about itself to the rest of the world and try to impose that model. And for Eastern Europe, very significantly and probably very well known to those of you who have worked on this before Larry Wolf's book, Inventing Eastern Europe, the map of civilization on the mind of the Enlightenment, basically pointing to how the category of Eastern Europe had to be coined as such, because a region that is as diverse as Eastern Europe and does not necessarily have the coherence that is being presupposed has to be invented as a coherent unit before it can be defined out of the norm that is presupposed by unmarked Europe, by Western Europe, that sees itself as the cradle of civilization, or the epitome rather of civilization, as well as its cradle. I'm not going to deal with these theoretical approaches. It was just kind of a wish to mention them, to have them maybe in the back of our minds. We can discuss some of them in the Q&A if you want. What I want to do in order to get to a different understanding of Europe than the one of coherence and unmarkedness is to think from a different perspective. And I'm taking Martinican scholar Edouard Glissant's notion that the West is not in the West. It is a project, not a place, in order to argue that the same goes for Europe. Europe is not a place. It is a project. It has been constructed and governed as a project for a very long time, long before the European Union became its concrete project. And as such, it is a work in progress. So it's a process. And as a work in progress, it creates and constantly reproduces problems. And here I come to how I was trying to get a grip of some of these problems. I like maps, although I'm not a cartographer, I'm not a geographer, but I make a lot of sense of maps and they kind of speak to me and I can use them in teaching. So around 2004, during the so-called Eastern enlargement of the European Union, the largest wave of the Eastern enlargement, the European Union was kind of offering all sorts of visual material to explain what was going to happen during the Eastern enlargement, and maps were part of this material. One of the maps that I was using a lot and that fascinated me, and I thought it makes great teaching material, was this one that you can still find online from the European Commission, that was actually detailing and color coding, if you want, the location of old or existing member states at the moment before the Eastern enlargement was supposed to happen, depicting the existing members of the European Union in yellow, depicting the 10 Eastern European countries that were supposed to join in 2004 and that did join in 2004 in blue, and depicting Romania and Bulgaria that had been denied accession in 2004 and had been postponed to the 2007 round in purple, but also depicting Turkey in purple. Although Turkey had been negotiating for accession since 1986 and is actually still not any closer to accession, but the group of the purple countries was basically the ones of the candidates at the moment that the 10 were supposed to be joining. And after the Eastern enlargement happened, of course, the map had to be updated. So it then looked like this. All of the then 25 members were depicted in yellow. To the candidate countries, Romania and Bulgaria, had been added Croatia, that at the time had become a candidate as well. Turkey was somehow depicted in a lighter gray. We don't know what that kind of shades of gray, pardon the pun, meant in that context, but obviously the lighter the gray, the worse your prospects of ever joining the European Union had become. But we can put that down also to the printing, because we have some shades of yellow there as well. So maybe the different grays did not mean much, but we see a big difference there between Romania, Bulgaria, and Croatia at least, and the rest of Eurasia. I was very interested in what that told us discursively and about the visual impact that such maps transported merely by defining European Union membership as belonging to Europe. So I was working with these maps without paying much attention that to the fact that both of them also depicted something else that I did not take into account at the time. And these are the territories also depicted in yellow in the upper right corner of both maps, both the pre-accession and the post-accession. And these are the territories of the European Union that are officially labeled overseas countries and territories, or outermost regions of the European Union. And they are depicted on all official maps of the European Union. So actually, this is not some compromise. This is not an accident that I happened to stumble upon the one map that depicts them as well. No official map of the European Union is actually allowed to leave them out. So in this case, I became interested in looking at not only the modernity of the discourse of Europe, but also the underlying coloniality and what I call the coloniality of memory. And for those of you not familiar with the concept of coloniality, a very short introduction. The notion of coloniality of power has been coined by Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano in the 90s in order to denote a number of hierarchies, political, economic, and sociocultural hierarchies between colonizers and colonized that, according to Quijano, emerged with the conquest of the Americas after the 15th century, so after 1492. And as such, coloniality represents capitalist modernity's dark side, its underside, everything that is not held up as a triumph and achievement of modernity. That's why the suffix is coloniality and not colonialism. That's one reason. So it's modernity, coloniality as two sides of the same coin. The other reason that it is coloniality and not colonialism is that for Quijano, coloniality is different both from pre-modern forms of colonial rule in that it translates the administrative hierarchies of colonial power and colony into a racial and ethnic division of labor in which the colonies became the racially inferiorized and subalternized, often the location of enslaved labor, of plantation economies, servicing and working to the benefit of the colonial power. And the central notion of coloniality with regard to colonialism is that coloniality is more encompassing. Those racial ethnic hierarchies put in place during colonialism, Quijano argues, stay in place after colonies become independent. So you have an administrative decolonization, but economic hierarchies of core periphery remain in place. Political hierarchies, depending on the decisions made in the core or in the metropole, still are the reality of former colonies. And basically racial hierarchies, as we know, are all over the place, but not being created out of thin air every time, but they are reproductions of the hierarchies put in place during colonial rule. So they're basically what remains from colonial rule in terms of coloniality. And so although the notion of coloniality sounds a bit like wordplay and having an own term to present, it's really very different from colonialism. So it's not about just coining a different term, it has a number of different dimensions. And drawing on that notion of coloniality of power, I'd like to speak of the coloniality of memory in the context of the territories belonging to Europe, officially belonging to Europe, and actually officially part of the European Union, that are systematically omitting from the public discourse of what Europe is. Although they are depicted on the maps, the discourse about what Europe is and what Europeanness is does not include them. At the same time, any overarching classification of these current colonial territories as regions of Europe is systematically avoided when they do happen to be mentioned, and sometimes this is necessary, especially in times of crisis, when there are hurricanes in the Caribbean and the parts of the Caribbean that belong to some European Union states, such as France, or to others, such as the Netherlands. So the official references to parts of what I like to call forgotten Europes are mostly in the media or in political discourse linked to the imperial history of individual states. We hear about islands in the Dutch Caribbean, we hear about the British West Indies, we hear about the French Antilles, but never about how these are European territories. We hear this, they have a history with their individual states. To make it more systematic rather than anecdotic, what I call forgotten Europes are divided between territories belonging to France and Great Britain, who have had the most colonial territories still in the 20th century. Now that belongs to Europe, not just the European Union since Brexit, right? Because the territories still held by Great Britain still belong to Great Britain, but Great Britain no longer is the European Union. But before Brexit, the European states that held most colonies still in most overseas territories overseas were France and Great Britain, followed by Denmark, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain. Like I mentioned, these territories are administratively part of the European states that colonized them, and consequently also of the European Union, again, before Brexit. Here, some of them are integrated, the so-called outermost regions, and others have associated status that has juridical consequences and consequences for instance, different voting rights. Voting in a referendum such as Brexit is, for instance, very important with regard to what status associated territories did not have a vote. And again, like I said, they are included in the official maps of the European Union. Before Brexit, the map of territories, both overseas countries and territories and outermost regions of the European Union looked like this, where the European Union member states on the continent were depicted in blue, and the blue stars were territories with integrated status. So they were officially part of the European Union. Their citizens had European Union or have European Union nationalities. And most of these territories also have the euro, use the euro as a currency. Of course, if the European state itself uses it. So that was not the case for Britain, for instance. The yellow stars are the so-called overseas countries and territories that have associated status, not always voting rights, and very different kind of categories and depending on which European state they belong to. So they're really not a homogeneous group. They all, however, so have European Union nationalities, but the Brexit one, the British ones, the French overseas departments all use the euro as official currency. And that was the reason why France also insisted that they should be depicted on the euro banknotes. So in case you never noticed, this is the location of all of the depicted territories on all of the euro banknotes, not just the 50. The back of the banknotes, not much explanation is given to about this by the European Central Bank. I was looking for some history of that, but under history, there's nothing to be found. There is something to be found under the rubric design elements, where the European Central Bank explains that the back of both series of euro banknotes, the old one and the new one, shows a geographic representation of Europe. And you can see here in the middle, some overseas territories of France where the euro is also used. So the Canary Islands and some overseas territories of France. The joke being that very small islands are not shown on the banknotes because they cannot be accurately reproduced using high volume offset printing, meaning that the lower the number of pixels, the lower your chances are of getting onto the banknote. But anyway, the only territory from this representation that can really be recognized is French Guiana because of its size. The rest is really, you have to guess or to know. But the European Central Bank gives a zoomed in version of all of them as well. So among all of these territories, I was particularly interested in those located in the Caribbean for one specific reason, but there are more. The reason being that over 1/3 of the European Union overseas countries and territories are located in the Caribbean. The rest, as you've seen in this map, are kind of dispersed across the world's oceans, but there is a high concentration of these territories in the Caribbean, which is why the attempt to understand and to name these territories as part of Europe makes sense in a rather coherent region or in a rather concentrated form. And so I discuss these territories using the notion of Caribbean Europe for a specific reason, to point to their visibility as European territories and as part of Europe, and to show how natural it has become for European Union maps to depict these territories without questioning whether or not their European location should be part of the criteria of considering them European. Whereas in the case of, and you've seen this in this map, in the case of Turkey, of course, a lot of the arguments, not the only ones, but a lot of the arguments of not giving the candidate status to Turkey were related to the fact that Turkey is not European, either in its tradition nor in its geographic location. This argument is never mobilized with regard to French Guiana, which is really not European, if we're just using a geographic criterion. Now, of course, the criteria are not always geographic, but what I'm looking at or what I'm interested in is the double standard, which is more than double, but it's actually a complex web of disparagement, really. So referring to Caribbean Europe, I detailed this category as all Caribbean territories that were previously colonized by a European power and that are presently administered as dependencies of a EU member or of the UK post-Brexit. And this includes the so-called outermost regions, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guiana, and the French overseas community of Saint-Martin, and the overseas countries and territories belonging to France, the UK, and the Netherlands. And you can see their names there. Not many of those names are or are very familiar because we don't hear much about these places at all, unless, like I said, there's a situation of crisis. Now, why is that even important? Why is that anything but a kind of quirky example of some European Union neglect of small territories? A lot of the times, the argument that these are small territories, not so many people live there, so why should we care, or why should we even theorize from there, is part of the reasons brought up by people why there's not a lot of discussion about these territories. I actually think it is important to rethink Europe from some of its marginal locations in order to understand how the narrative of Europe is constructed. And there's almost no more marginal location than these territories never considered as part of Europe and not conveniently considered as part of Europe, which is why if we think Europe from the Caribbean or from its Caribbean territories, several things happen. The first one is a drastic redrawing of EU borders. If we think of French Guiana, of Guadeloupe, Martinique, Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire as Europe, then the discourse, the self-definition of Europe and the European Union should be the western border of the European Union is in South America and the Caribbean. We don't hear much about the western border. The one that has been discussed and debated and disputed has been the eastern border. Is it the Urals? Is Turkey in Europe? Is it only half in Europe? And which half? And is the Bosporus? So there's a lot of talk about the eastern border. Since refugees are dying in the Mediterranean, there's a lot of talk about the southern border as well. Not so much as it used to be a debate about the eastern border, but there's increasingly talk about the southern border. But the western border, we seem to know where it is. It's the western coast of Portugal. That's the coast, the western border of Europe. If we think of Caribbean Europe and French Guiana and South America as part of Europe, then this changes. And actually, the European Union knows that, because this is the map that the European Union has released after Brexit in order to correct the map that includes British territories, showing it doesn't say EU's borders, but it says these are overseas territories and outermost regions. So these are here, the outermost regions of the European Union after Brexit, and these are the overseas countries and territories after Brexit. So the map looks much tidier because Britain had half of all of these territories. So it looks like the world has decolonized all of a sudden to a large extent. Now, it's not only the western borders, but it's also EU's external borders that moves when we think about these territories as European, because one of the things that happen is that we realize that the longest French border is that between France and Brazil through the border between French Guiana and Brazil, which also incidentally is not only France's longest border, but one of the deadliest. At the same time, Netherlands borders Venezuela and the US through a maritime border in the Caribbean. That obviously doesn't happen on the continent. Netherlands cannot border Venezuela and the US, but also internal borders of the EU are relocated through the fact that territories belonging to different European states are arranged differently, of course, in the Caribbean than they are on the continent. So on the continent, France doesn't border the Netherlands, but it does so in the Caribbean through the island of Saint Martin, which is half French and half Dutch. And the UK borders the Netherlands in the Caribbean through the island of Anguilla, that also shares a border with the Dutch part of Saint Martin. So these are basically geographic, but also epistemological shifts that happen, because the minute we tell a story in which Europe is not in Europe, just as Plisson said, the West is not in the West, it's a project. We realize how little convenient it is to have a discourse about Europe having borders in South America, having borders in the Caribbean, and not being able to claim the coherence and the centrality that make it the unmarked category that Europe claims to be, that make it the epitome of civilization and of modernity. And from these geographic criteria, some other consequences flow as well, the fact that we have different concepts of sovereignty, I'm not going to be able to get into a lot of detail, but basically in discussions about what it means to be modern, the idea of the sovereign modern nation state is central. And sociological theory, but also history, has tended to discuss empires and nation states as mutually exclusive and chronologically discrete. So you have empires, and when they're over, when empires collapse, you have the emergence of nation states. So basically, not only sociology, but a lot of social theory more generally explains away the fact that the Habsburg, the Ottoman, and the Tsarist Empire survived well into the 20th century, but not only survived, but were quite impactful. But they are depicted as in decline and in inevitable decline because empires kind of cede to nation states. The literature elaborated about the cases that I just presented in the Caribbean points to the paradoxes and to the incoherences of such a discourse by talking about the different dilemmas that arise out of a situation in which you have colonies in the 21st century, but nobody talks about them as colonies because it is no longer a convenient political language, but some of them have never stopped being colonies. They have been colonized by the same European state for centuries. That never changed, only the label that they now have is another one. So it's outermost regions or overseas countries and territories. So some authors talk about extended statehood in the case of Dutch territories, basically extending the statehood of the Netherlands into the Caribbean, but having in that extended arm, basically less rights and less possibilities. Others have talked about post-colonial sovereignty gains, discussing how the fact that a situation of non-sovereignty sometimes entails a different negotiating position, so that states that are in a dependent position can use that dependency sometimes to their advantage, but mostly it is their disadvantage, thus creating a sort of game-like situation. And others, such as Yarimar Bonilla, have derived new categories out of those that their interview partners, in this case, people who were on strike in Guadeloupe against low wages in the French state, were using in order to refer to this situation of lack of sovereignty by saying, maybe we shouldn't become independent. Maybe sovereignty is not the solution if it's the only measure being taken after centuries of colonial rule. If that situation has lasted for such a long time, then the colonial state needs to take responsibility. Just becoming independent would be what Caribbean scholars have called flag independence. You have a national day to celebrate and you have a flag and maybe you have a passport, but you're left to your own devices after centuries of colonial rule. Maybe the solution are non-sovereign futures, one in which the situation of non-sovereignty is maintained, but the colonial state pays some form of indemnity, some form of reparation, some form of attuning for what colonial rule has meant for such a long time. And for the specific situation of Brexit, that also has implications, and I'm going to end with that example. The island of Anguilla in the Caribbean is the one that I mentioned before as bordering the Netherlands, but also bordering France, through the fact that this island Saint-Martin is half French and half Dutch. What we never heard in Brexit negotiations is the status that Anguilla had and basically the threat posed to Anguilla by Brexit, which is a much harder border than the one often discussed in the case of Ireland and often discussed in the case of Gibraltar, because yes, this is a maritime border, Anguilla is separated through by Saint-Martin through its own, if we want to say English channel. It's called Anguilla Channel. So it's basically a mirror miniature of the UK-French border in the Caribbean. But Anguilla does not have specialized medical facilities, does not have an airport, and does not have a international port. So it depends for medical care, for international transport, and it is dependent on tourism, on having a soft border with Saint-Martin, which has always been the case. People go back and forth. People have family and all sorts of work relations on both sides of the Anguilla Channel, only that this becoming a hard border was never discussed in Brexit negotiations, which the representatives of Anguilla in London tried to change by drafting several reports, one even mentioning the name of Britain's forgotten EU border. I was very happy to hear that they thought that this is a forgotten border, and this is not just a category that I come up with when I speak of forgotten Europes. Still, Theresa May did not take any action with respect to this. So a year later, the Anguilla representatives came up with a second report, Anguilla and Brexit, the solution, even offering bilateral agreements with the different, so with the Netherlands and France, that would be able to come into play once Brexit is enacted, because then it would be possible to avoid what for them would be a real catastrophe. I'm trying to show a very short video that details this, and that brings us back to how race plays into it. So I hope the sound carries.
Well, the impact of Britain's departure from the EU is being felt as far away as the Caribbean. Residents of the British Overseas Territory of Anguilla have UK passports, but they weren't allowed to vote in the referendum. Yet their relationship with the European Union is fundamental to their everyday life. Anguilla is 4,000 miles from the UK in the Eastern Caribbean. It depends on the neighbouring island of Saint-Martin, first just 10 miles across the sea, for vital services. But Saint-Martin is half French and half Dutch. So will that strong relationship change after Brexit? Nisha Dupi lives in Anguilla and has been talking to some of the islanders.
That's where a lot of my family live. They've migrated from Anguilla for maybe centuries. So that's why I'm concerned as to what will happen after Brexit.
And we didn't vote, but that's the price we pay for being an overseas territory.
Do you feel British? Am I British? Can I openly say that and feel comfortable that I'm a British person? Or are we just a little dot hanging with a name that is not really true to us?
My name is Nisha Dupi, and I live in Britain, or a part of it called Anguilla. Across the sea, 10 miles away is France, or Saint Martin, a French and Dutch island. We are closer, more reliant on it even than Britain is to France. A large part of our transport, food, and health services come from Saint Martin. Last year, Anguilla was hit by Hurricane Irma, but the big storm this year is Brexit. Will we be cut off from the European neighbor we so depend on?
Anguilla and Saint Martin is like brother and sister, or brother and brother. You know, it's, we depend on each other.
Do you ever find yourself having to go to Saint Martin to use any of the services?
Oh, yes, all the time. You know, the health services, medicine. My wife, she depends on them very strongly. She has to take certain medication every day of her life. So she has to go there for that.
Do you feel that in light of all of this, Anguillians should have been consulted?
At least we would have been treated as human beings, like people recognize that we are here, you know, and that our lives value something.
Right. So this is from 2018 in November. So you'd think by now the situation had been cleared up. It hasn't, although Brexit has happened and although all decisions have been made, including also having putting Gibraltar, making Gibraltar part of Schengen in order to solve the situation for Gibraltar. This hasn't been solved for Anguilla, but the effects are not yet to be seen because the borders, all the borders are still closed because of COVID. So there is a lag in seeing the effects, both of the pandemic and of Brexit, or maybe these are two pandemics in this case. I'm closing by hopefully going back to the idea of coherent Europe. What I tried to show was how the notion of Europe as an unmarked category, or as one that does not need to be qualified. It's Europe in theory, and it's the sanitized version that does not take into account colonialism, imperialism, or the East or the South of Europe seriously, is one that needs to be complicated. And by complicating, we can mean several things, either discussing the many and the manifold inequalities in Europe, or the many unequal Europes, or what I tried to do here, I didn't get into the notion of creolizing Europe, but basically making sure that this geographical, cultural, religious, and racial coherence is disturbed, is basically made transparent that this is a geopolitical construct that does not hold up. So a shift from a coherent Europe to a complicated, productively complicated creolized Europe would take into account that the discourse of the European Union is one that has monopolized the term Europe without being true to the history or the present of the continent or of the members of the European Union themselves. So creolizing the notion of Europe in this context would mean taking into account relations of power with the territories colonized and occupied by European states until today. In the specific case that I talked about, it would be thinking Europe from the Caribbean and South America, but more generally, it is a proposal to think modernity from coloniality, basically from its dark side that is too seldom mentioned in negotiations and too seldom discussed as part of what makes Europe. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Manuela. And now we are, well, now you see, I can finally recognize what is a hand clap and what is a hand being raised to ask a question. So those of you who have comments or questions, you may either raise your hand or you can put them in the chat box. Anywhere you wish to do it is fine. Okay, Nikolai.
I guess I'll go first if nobody else is willing to. First of all, great pleasure to listen to Manuela as always, because we know each other. That's why I'm saying this, and I've listened to her speak. What I wanted to ask Manuela is if you can continue a little bit where you left off at the end, maybe say a little bit more about the notion of creolizing Europe. But I'm also interested in particular, as long as, of course, the concept is even applicable and useful, if we use that term or that alternative methodology to think about Eastern Europe. So if you want to think about, for example, creolizing Eastern Europe, that of course you haven't talked about as much today, even though I know you have worked on it quite a bit. What could that possibly look like? What are the implications of this effort to sort of challenge normative thinking about empire and nation states civilizational superiority, etc., heterogeneity, multiplicity, opacity, if we think with Glissant, for example, what could creolizing Eastern Europe perhaps look like? Even though I know it's a bit of a stretch, maybe from what you talked about today, but if it's a useful question, I hope maybe you can tell us, you can give us a few hints. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikolai. No, definitely, those two are connected, right? So whatever is left out of the Europe in theory is passable to creolization. For a long time, I thought that thinking Europe from Eastern Europe is the necessary and sufficient critical edge. So I did that work thinking that if I focus on the maps that represent Eastern Europe as not really central to Europe and they have to Europeanize, then that is a discourse of disparagement that gives me a critical edge. I just realized there's more to it than that, and that there are other exclusions that are even more blatant. This is why I focused on these Caribbean territories as a follow-up. But of course, you're right. They're connected also in the sense that the creolization of one or the other are kind of contributions to thinking Europe differently. And I had some slides on people who have worked on this notion of creolization, both regarding Europe and regarding theory more generally. So the idea of creolizing theory as a way of thinking from peripheral locations, from colonial histories, of thinking and through and bringing race into the discussion of Europe, which is something that is being done in the past maybe 2 decades, if we're optimistic, but it hasn't become central to discussions of Europe. And the idea that Europe can still be imagined as white, Christian, civilized, and coherent is an uncreolized notion of Europe. Bringing in the history of Eastern Europe is already a sort of creolization, but not if the Eastern European history is one of Christian nations that were more Christian than Western Europe, and thus made it possible for Western Europe to remain Christian. But by bringing in Roma slavery in Romania, by bringing in the history of European empires as not the sick man of Europe that was dying in the 20th century, but a very active empire that was very much in competition. So I'm talking about the Ottoman Empire, very much in competition with modern colonial empires up until the 20th century as well. So not a remnant of imperial power, but very much a force in a capitalist modernity. So bringing these histories that do not go well with the history of a coherent Europe are ways of complicated productively, in my view, the notion of Europe. And we can call them creolization, but I don't insist on that being the only term. I use that term as a metaphor, but also as a method. Others like Lyonnais and Xu have, and maybe I can show this one slide to because it has a quote. Oh, okay. So this is one of the books called Creolizing Europe, Legacies and Transformations by Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez and Shirley Tate, where they focused on migrations and think if we see how central migration has been to Europe, both migration from Europe and migration into Europe, to understand European history, then we no longer can put forth a notion of a coherent, homogeneous Europe that only now is beginning to get some cracks. And Lyonnais and Xu that I just mentioned have this book called The Creolization of Theory, from which I want, I wanted to give this quote. They say, if minor formations become method and theory, then new analytics will be brought to the foreground to creolize the universalisms we live with today, doing so from the bottom up and from the inside out. It is this process of becoming theory of the minor that we're also calling creolization. And I found this very inspiring because they not only say, let's think from peripheral locations, but let's make the periphery theory. Let's make the minor theory. And interestingly for me, these small territories, small islands are always disparaged on account of their smallness. But if we reverse that thinking, it is precisely the minor becoming theory, let's think Europe from the Caribbean, that then becomes a method and not an accident. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, there's several comments that I'll call on people in order. There's Eduardo, then Rita, and then Dradistra, in that order.
Oh, shall I just read them and answer from?
Well, if they don't want to read them themselves,
okay.
Like to hear, but you can do it if you wish.
Okay. So Eduardo is asking, since when do we start finding this sanitized notion of Europe? That's a great question. I think versions of the sanitized notion had been there since the 15th, 16th centuries, when you have this gap starting to grow between the Western colonial empires finding outlets both for their populations and for their resources overseas, whereas those European states that lost out in the colonial competition or that did not have colonies at all were becoming the agricultural periphery. So that's where Eastern Europe starts kind of sliding out of the definition of Europe generally. But I think it becomes really sanitized or sublimated once it is part of a theorization of Europe, once it becomes the subject of social history, sociology, political science from the perspective of Europe. And then it becomes textbook material. It's very easy to make textbook material into a caricature of what you're actually trying to convey. And that's when sanitization works well, I think.
Okay, and the next one is Rita.
Right. So according to Spivak, there's post-colonialism. Former colonizers have left their linguistic and cultural baggage behind. When they left, they feel small nations that have continued the French or English language and culture may find themselves in a more favorable place. Wow, another great question. In a more favorable place in a complex that is a zero-sum game. So if you're in a more favorable place in a capitalist world economy, you're in a more favorable place at the expense of someone else. In that sense, yes, there is maybe a tiny advantage in terms of circulation of messages, of communication, not of political messages and not of negotiations, I would say. Because if we look at India and Britain, it's not like we know a lot more about India because a lot of people still speak English or keep speaking English. Yes, Routledge has an India subsidiary. That means they can sell books cheaper that still have the label Routledge on them. Is that an advantage or a disadvantage? It is both, I think. It is part of a structure of exploitation that makes it possible to sell English language books to a larger, huge audience because of the legacy of colonial rule. I wouldn't just make it into an advantage for the population that speaks a language of better circulation. It actually offers more advantages to having put in place this language to the former colonial power. Does that answer your question?
Okay, Dradistra, you want to read your own?
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And thank you for a great talk. As I said, my questions is like in two parts, but they're sort of joined together. So is it the case that because some places like Anguilla are so far away and they've been a part of us for so long, that many current generations in their current decisions aren't aware of the impact their decisions will have in other people or places like Anguilla? And also, does this therefore mean that the project of Europe in its past form is now, in a sense, over?
These are several great questions. Yes, I think, especially in the case of Anguilla, which is the oldest British colony, it's been a British colony since 1650s.
Nope.
Might have been a huge factor, the factor in the 17th century. I think it's a very bad excuse in the 21st century to neglect a territory for being too far away. It doesn't hold anymore. So if it was a reason 3 centuries ago, it should no longer be one. And I don't think this is a matter of geographical proximity now or in the past. I think it's a matter of political visibility. And if such places are never part of the definition of who we are and what the territory is, and there's parallels to other situations as well. The Caribbean does not just contain European territories, it contains US territories as well. How often is the discussion of who we are in the US about Puerto Rico? That's in a sense a very similar situation that would have the argument of geographic proximity right there. So it's not that the territory is too far flung. It's just not made politically visible because it's not politically convenient. So does this mean that the project, going back to Europe, the project of Europe is now over? I think there was never just one project. They were related in kind of putting forth the provincial part of Europe that has become now the coherent, the unmarked part, Northwestern Europe. But there were different projects, and I think as an elite project, it's still very much with us. If we want to engage with it critically, it's not over, it's a different project. So we need to discuss and construct Europe differently, or as I put it several times, Europe otherwise, borrowing from the slogan of the World Social Forum. But that would have to be another project. It's not that one has to be over for another to start. A critical project is its own world and can make its own alternatives, I think.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Any other questions? Any other hands up?
I'm going to turn on the light because it's getting very dark in here.
But we should wait until Manuela gets back before we ask any other questions. Are there any other questions?
Gary, I have a question. I'm sorry, everyone, I'm in the car. I hope, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I actually typed it up, but it got erased on my phone, so I'll just pose it. Thank you, Manuela, for your talk. Really informative and thought-provoking. But I was thinking the term coloniality has been very productive for decolonial thinkers at NYI here in the what is queer decolonial studies. We were talking about Maria Lugones and the coloniality of gender. So I was curious to hear more about how you use the concept of the coloniality of memory in the context of what you talked about today. So could you expand and elaborate a bit on that? Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, that's great. It's I worked with this concept precisely for the Caribbean territories, or for all the overseas territories in particular, but of course it can be expanded to discuss more of what is left out of the history we're accustomed to, or the history that we're taught. And I think if we speak about revolutions and we define them, the revolutions of the modern world, as the American and the French Revolution, but not the Haitian Revolution, that is another example of the coloniality of memory, because this is very much an important event in world history, just as the French Revolution, I mean, the Haitian Revolution as the revolution of the enslaved that kind of robbed France of its richest colony of the time and was a huge world historical event. How come we don't know about it as much? It cannot be an accident. It wasn't just the reprint of the same history book that didn't tell the story. It was a political decision. So coloniality of memory functions by systematically leaving out, systematically reproducing blind spots in order to create a different narrative. And most of the time, the narrative it creates is a narrower, a poorer one, which is why I think creolization is a way of enriching and bringing back the blind spots and what has been left out, and kind of uncovering these gaps is a way of learning more in terms of relearning rather than correcting. So it's not just discussing the correct version of history, because as historians well know, there's no such thing. But history has been told and mostly written by the victors. And if we want to think history in Europe, revolutions, or Europe as a political formation from coloniality, then we need to uncover the perspective of those who were left out or were oppressed or never made it into theory. And a lot of people never made it into theory. This is why a lot of the discussions taking place in sociology, I have a big problem with my discipline, are reinventing the wheel. Everything appears new if you're not aware of a global perspective. And if you're not aware of the millions and millions of Europeans who migrated to the colonies, then migration becomes a 20th century phenomenon, because that's when people start coming into Europe. But that's why we need to remember and to kind of incorporate the memory of colonial history as part of the history of Europe, in order to have a global understanding of where history was taking place. It wasn't just taking place in the place we call Europe. Europe was all over the place, and that's also where its history is.
Okay, now Eduardo has been posting any number of very thought-provoking comments. Eduardo, do you want to read them out yourself, or shall we ask Manuela to do it again?
Oh, okay. Anguilla is no longer economically interesting.
I'm at a very loud place. Okay.
Oh, okay. Anguilla is no longer economically interesting compared to its situation before, say, the 19th century. Yes and no. That's the argument is made a lot that actually the European states are no longer interested in even having these territories, and they would be happy to be rid of them. It's not exactly true, and it's very different for different territories. For the UK, it is very interesting to have territories in the Caribbean for stock exchange purposes. Because if the City of London closes at night, but the US stock market opens while the UK stock market sleeps, then you're at a disadvantage. But if some of your Caribbean locations function as, and they are, UK territories, where stock exchange business can take place, then you're closer to the US stock market in time zones, and that is an advantage. The same reason why the very badly famed tax havens, normally considered a problem of Caribbean states, and those states that are seen as corrupt, and basically the history of the pirates now translates into tax havens and corruption in the 21st century, are the result of policies of fiscal deregulation by those states that to which these Caribbean territories belonged or still belong. So setting up tax havens is a way of making sure that there are enclaves where some taxes do not apply, where some laws do not apply, where some conditions are different. The same also, not to just bash the UK, same goes for the Netherlands. If you go to Curaçao, there's a category called a tax relaxed, no, sorry, a duty relaxed zone. I'd never heard of it. So it's not duty free. And it's not the normal taxation, but it's duty relaxed. It's purposefully thought for cruise ships that bring lots of people for 2 hours on the island. They release them for 2 hours to go shopping, and that shopping becomes interesting because it's a duty relaxed zone, but it's actually EU territory, not EU territory. It's part of a territory that belongs to EU state. That's a different juridical status. So that makes for the possibility of duty relaxed. Where does the profit go? Obviously not Curaçao, right? So it doesn't stay on the island. It's part of the Netherlands circuit. So there's many ways in which, what I'm saying with this, many ways in which these territories are very interesting to the European states, of course, as holiday destinations, but that's the most evident one, maybe.
Okay, anyone else? We can go another 5 minutes. Okay, Giovanni.
Thanks a lot, Manuela. So inspiring and eye-opening, really. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the implications of theorizing from elsewhere for critical race, for the theory of race. I mean, we know that the geography of theory matters a lot. From where are we talking about? From where are we theorizing? And so maybe one hypothesis that was circulating in my mind is that theorizing race from the Caribbean would look much different than theorizing race from New York City or from Rome or from London. And so, or maybe not. And so maybe if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great opportunity to pick up one of the central issues that we want to discuss here, of course. And I think you're right that theorizing race from the Caribbean would be different for more than just one reason. Not only because it's not the US or it's not the UK, or mainland UK, so to say, but because for a very long time, the Caribbean was constructed as the very opposite of Europe. And one of the things that made it the very opposite was the idea that that's where race is. Europe does not have race. Europe is white. Europe is on its way, and as the discourse, especially with regards to industrialization was being constructed, was one in which industrialization and wage labor, whiteness and modernity go hand in hand. And then you have this place with this legacy of plantation slavery and with racial conflicts and inequalities that is at the same time so permeated by the legacy of slave labor that wage labor will never become the norm, or it will take forever to do so. So all of these dimensions are entangled. It's not just race that is different, is the understanding that the matrix, or if you will, the tissue out of which modernity, industrialization, civilization, and progress are woven is one in which race does not play a role. And all of these elements were important in order to construct the idea of the coherent Europe that when it does encounter race, it's because it's brought from outside. It's because of this 20th century migration, but Europe really didn't know that before. It had some, there was one exception, that the Holocaust was some kind of racial tragedy, but then that's it, because Europe had gone past that. And I think the chance here resides in seeing how much of European history is happening in the place that it tried so hard to define out of its own image, the Caribbean. So there's no Europe without the Caribbean. We know that for industrialization since Eric Williams, because the resources produced under slave labor were essential for industrialization in Europe. But if we see that also in terms of race, there is a different picture, I think, that we can draw of how even ethnic homogeneity that Europe was trying to project to the outside world as its characteristic was created at the expense of other locations defined out of Europeanness, such as the Caribbean. I always like to use, or often like to use this quote of a character in Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses, who says, the problem with the English is that their history happened overseas, so they don't know what it means. And the idea is that it was British history happening in places like India and places like the Caribbean, but is not being taught as British history, and it's not considered British history because it's no longer in the island that Britain became. So that disconsidering that part of history is disconsidering a lot, and most of this history has to do with racialization and defining race out of your own self-image. Maybe I went off on a branch after your question, but I hope I answered at least.
That's what these things are for. Okay, I'm going to have to call an end to it. Those of you who want to continue, if Manuela has the time, can do it in, tell me again, John, where they can do it, because I've forgotten. But
Well, there's the NYI social space.
the
where
social space, if you want to.
The special space for this lecture series where people can pose questions, and we'll make sure Manuela has the access.
Okay. But,
yep.
But anyway, thank you, Manuela. You generated a very, very lively conversation. Very well done. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thanks for the great questions. All the dynamic conversation lives out of dialogue, so thanks a lot.
Thank you.